Hello, YouTube. It's Ron Yarn DM back for another little ramble. This time, it's been discussion in person as well as online. Uh, Railroading. You know, there's different schools of thought on it. Some people like to play like it's a already written book, and their characters are participants in the story. And that requires a certain amount of what some people would call railroading, scripting that the DM does that directs where everybody goes, and then their actions, once the situation is set, determine the outcomes. Players tend not to like that. That's why they use the pejorative form of calling it railroading. But I've also noticed that players do it their own. They try to steer the DM to tell a story they want to tell. You know, you've got your little backstory all written up, and you're the long lost heir to some empire or something like that, and so you want the entire story to revolve around your quest to regain that throne, or however you see that story unfold. Problem with that, as an old player, you're playing with other people. It's not just you and the DM telling the story. There are other people, many of them have their own backstories that they wouldn't mind being roped in and somehow intertwined. So it's not all about your individual story. Now, I'm scolding the players a little bit. I'll be scolding the DM a little bit too, so bear with me. Sometimes players also get a little injured pride because they come up with these carefully crafted backstories they think would be a wonderful campaign arc and so on and so forth. But the DM doesn't even use it because he's got a slightly different story arc that he's telling, and you didn't bother to find out from him what sort of story he wanted to tell to create a backstory that would feed into it naturally. This is especially true if the DM is picking up an extra game to satisfy people. This has happened to me. And rather than spending, because you don't have a lot of time to put into something like that. So you basically say, okay, I've got all these little modules. It describes it from first level on up to high levels. Great campaign arc, that's what I'll do. That way, all you've got to do for your prep time as a DM is prep the module. Guess what, players? That module doesn't know a thing about your player character. So if you're going to be running in a game like that, and if the DM's not being forthright, that's a no-no for him. But if you're going to be playing in that, and you know he's just running a bunch of modules, I really wouldn't go into a great deal of backstory. Certainly not set any particular goals aside from adventure, right, wrongs, whatever broad objective could fit into that campaign arc. So remember there are other players at the table, and remember the DM may not want to play your story. And incidentally, you probably should not run yourself if you're that sort of a player, because you yourself wind up being the railroading DM, because I've seen it. I've seen it before. In writing, they call it the Mary Sue, where the writer is wishing that they could be interacting with a particular major iconic character in some genre of fiction. And so they're the love interest perhaps, or the best friend or whatever, but somehow they are become an integral part of, say, Captain Kirk or Indiana Jones or Captain Picard, or pick your Luke Skywalker. Pick your character. And so writers like that are called Mary Sues. Well, a player that gets so fixated on a particular story arc that, and they've got the NPC that they're going to play because they're going to live vicariously through that NPC and make all the players play that character story. That's a frustrated player because a DM did not allow that, and they're so latched and in love with that story arc that, well, the DM's not going to do it, I'll do it. Now, DM's turn. It's a difficult job. I understand it. And sometimes it's a little too easy to over prep your game and your campaign. It's one thing to want to control the flow of the story and not have it go off the rails. I didn't intend for that to feed into the railroading concept, but if the players don't feel like they have any choice in the matter, that no matter what they do, whatever you've determined is what they've got to do, is what they're going to do, then it becomes not role-playing, playing a role, but role-playing, rolling dice. There's got to be a balance as a DM that you've got to maintain between those two things, giving them the freedom to make choices, even if they may be bad choices from what you've got planned. Remember, failure is an option. And if you're a creative enough DM, you can take the party's failure and turn it into story. So don't get too fixated on what it is. Where a lot of DMs fall into the rut, get a little too controlling, especially is in trying to set up the scenario. There's critical information the players have got to know so that they have some basis of information to make their initial decisions as they set off on the adventure. And then as they explore the area, they start uncovering more information that then provides them with more clues. But if you want to be a railroad DM, then why have more than one door leading out of a room? Because then their choice is going back and leaving this or going on. If you've got even one dungeon where there's two possible exits out of the room, you're giving them a choice. Relax the controls. You will like it. If you're creative, you're going to love what they do. That's going to make you have to go, oh, wait a minute, I hadn't planned that. Sometimes that's the best DMing. It's actually kind of lazy DMing to have everything so planned out that you can predict exactly what's going to be happening from that point on. Because you've got players, and players are individuals. And they are going to want to make decisions as they role play their character that may not fit in with what you want them to do. That's why the introduction to every adventure is important. It's information that's got to be given out. I've got an adventure that I'm about to be in as a player where they're actually doing that part in a really good way. Pieces have been disseminated to the players, and the players are going to give the briefing, the other characters. So that's much more involved, that's much more integrated, and it's going to enable the players to role play a little bit more as they ask their fellows questions and so on and so forth, as opposed to the prepared. 5 centuries ago, the ancient wizard Karatacon was known to be creating all these constructs, and now the last 5 years, this village has been having constructs rampaging through their crops, or spoiling their crops, and they've pooled together all the resources to hire a group of adventurers to handle this. And that's perfectly fine. I may have to create that adventure, but that's a perfectly fine start to an adventure. But it's going to be a lot more satisfying to your players, I think, if you hand out pieces of information, because everybody loves having information. Sometimes this is a two-edged sword. Sometimes the player enjoys it so much that he may keep pieces of information, critical pieces of information, from his party, and you're sitting there in your seat behind the screen going, you're not telling them everything. They need to know this. Why aren't you telling them this? Well, he's role playing. Character choices, you got to let it flow. So I would say if you're going to do that sort of approach to introducing an adventure, you might want to make sure that the player is playing a character that's going to be forthcoming with all of the information that you've given out. But it's not a failure or a destruction of your campaign if you misjudge that and you do have a player that wants to keep some information, because it could play into something interesting. For one thing, okay, great. You kept a piece of information to yourself from your comrades. How is that player going to capitalize it? As the DM, you can always sit there and say, okay, wise guy, fine and dandy. You're going to try and use that information for yourself. I'm going to make sure that the puzzle or challenge to overcome, to get that piece of information, that little reward that you might be thinking to get for yourself, is so overwhelming that you need to fill your fellow players in so that you can get their help to achieve it. Well done. And then, of course, there's more role-playing opportunity there, because everybody's going to be, and you were going to tell us about this when exactly? So, personally, I'm not big into intra-party conflict myself. I understand it when it comes from a role-playing point, but some people will force it. I've been in many adventure groups where it was somebody just, they don't like kumbaya parties, so they immediately come up with a character concept that's going to ruffle feathers or disrupt things. And usually when it's forced, it's not that much fun. It's a lot, if you're going to have conflict in the party, it's a lot more enjoyable if it's an organic thing. And I'm not talking about, well, elves hate dwarves, so this is a party of elves, I'm going to create a dwarf. You know, it's much more entertaining where somebody, for instance, has a passion for dragons, and through play, somebody has a character that really begins to develop a serious dislike for dragons. And because that's developing through play, the conflict between the two characters becomes a little bit more engaging, and also not nearly so acrimonious, because they can understand, having history together, where the other is coming from. And so it can turn into a series of good-natured jibes at each other, kind of like you see in Star Wars. That's the main reason I'm not a fan of intra-party conflict, is because it does sometimes lead to blows. And as a DM, I hate player versus player combat. That's no fun for me as a DM. So I would much prefer a player who's getting that acrimonious with another character to have his character basically say, all right, fine, I'm out. See you guys later. It was nice knowing you. And have that character leave, and then maybe create a new character who might not have the issues that the previous character had. And if it's player versus player, there's not a lot that can be done, quite honestly. I've been fortunate as a DM in this regard, in that when I have players that don't like each other or don't get along at all, usually the problem takes care of itself. One or the other just stops coming. I've never had to kick someone out of one of my groups. I can break them into different groups. All the children play nicely, as it were, but And I've always been able to keep my players going. It's just usually the problem player just leaves the group. But getting back to the railroading, and it doesn't have to be box text, the flavor text that completely. And I had one guy who literally he'd hold a box over his head while running at conventions, indicating I'm reading a whole bunch of narrative text from the module. Don't interrupt me with questions because I'm reading right now. Sometimes modules get a little carried away with that, and as players have got to roll with it, especially if you're at a convention where nobody knows anybody. But if it's continual like that, you're writing a book, not an adventure. Keep it minimal, keep it completely relevant, and then get out of the way. Let the players play. Trust them to make choices. They may make right choices, they may make wrong choices. They make wrong choices, have penalties, or make things a little more difficult, or even take it down a whole new road. But if their wrong choices mean they fail at the quest, let that have some kind of a ramification in their world as well, so that next time maybe they think more about the problem than being about creative. There's ways to control it, and I would say probably above all, don't try to control the rate of advancement by being stingy with experience points or whatever. It's very simple. Pathfinder and 3rd edition D&D spelled it right out. 13 average encounters should equal a level. That's a lot of encounters when you consider 4 encounters, major encounters, in an adventure, usually, for a 4-hour block of time. That's 2 or 3 adventures, because some of those encounters are going to be more than average challenge, because players like to be challenged. But 13 encounters is more than enough time for a level gain. So I mean, personally, I tend to be very generous with XPs at the very beginning because I like to tell epic stories, and so I try to get people beefed up to the point where they can face the kind of enemies I want them to face. But I run into people that, well, my campaign arc is going to take 5 years, and at the end of those 5 years, they're going to be probably around 8th level. I've got one game master that's a little on that side, but he's got a range at least. He's not saying they're going to be at the end of this time this level. He's like they're anywhere from a minimum to a maximum range. And that's probably because he's calculating 13 encounters per level. And he knows how often they're playing, and he knows how many encounters they're going to have. So at that point, it's math for the DM. And so I don't have any problem with that. So, as in all things, moderation. Players, you can be as guilty of attempting to railroad the DM as the DM is of railroading you. Bear in mind both sides. A certain level of information has got to come out. Players, you can always ask your DM what sort of stuff is going to be in the campaign to create a backstory that will organically, naturally mesh in with that campaign without asking him to do any extra work just for your character. Or be as fanciful as possible, but don't be upset if all that work goes to nothing because the DM's not including it. DMs, remember, players enjoy feeling like they're not only making choices, but they're making choices that matter. So railroad them if you must, only as far as it takes to get them started on the adventure. Once the adventure starts, you're giving the ball to them, and you're adjudicating their actions. But don't keep channeling them from encounter to encounter. Just get them started. That would be my recommendation as in terms of moderation. Let the railroading be the informational gurgitation that they need, the dump, the information dump that they need to get started on the adventure. It's that simple. Here's everybody, both sides, remember, everybody's playing a game. And if one person is perceived as having his or her will followed more often than anyone else's, people aren't going to enjoy it. Let everyone have their say. Let everyone be able to do something. So, once again, if you have any particular issues you'd kind of like me to ramble on about, leave a comment in the video notes. Reach out to me on Facebook and ask me a question, and I will be only too happy to ramble on, natter on about it on the next video. Until the next time, may all your hits be crits.